Hello and welcome. I'm Charlotte Gibson, president of Charlottesville Now. Thank you to everyone joining us for tonight's program about the serious issue of gun violence against women and children. And now onto our program, which will be introduced tonight by Kathy Falzer, Vice President of Action and Programs. Thank you, Kathy, for your and your committee's work in putting together this program. And many thanks to our speakers, Renee Branson, Katie Fox, Mike Fox, and Madison Furgurson, and Gayle for so generously sharing their time and expertise with us this evening. Kathy?
Thanks, Charlotte. Hello and welcome. I'm Kathy Falzer, First Vice President of Charlottesville Now. Thank you to everyone joining us for tonight's program to address the issue of gun violence against women and children. Before beginning our program, I want to acknowledge that the land we are on is the home of the Monacan Indian Nation, one of the oldest groups of indigenous people still residing on their ancestral homeland. Please join us in acknowledging the Monacan people as the traditional custodians of this land and in paying respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And now on to the topic tonight. Nationwide, 62% of female intimate partner homicide victims were killed with a gun. In Virginia, from 2015 to 2019, 111 women were fatally shot by an intimate partner. Guns are the leading cause of death among children and teens in Virginia. An average of 85 die by guns every year. Nationally, according to CDC data, in 2020, guns were the leading cause of death for US children and teens, killing more than 4,300, a 29% increase over 2019. Plus, women in the US are 28 times more likely to be killed by guns than women in other high-income countries. And as if we needed the reminder how destructive a gun can be, we would be remiss if we did not mention the recent use of a gun that was my husband who's in New Jersey playing golf. If we did not mention the recent use of a gun in the mass killing of 10 persons in Buffalo as an act of racism. As reported by Everytown for Gun Safety, intimate partner violence and gun violence in the US are inextricably linked, impacting millions of women, families, and communities across the country. Abusers with firearms are 5 times more likely to kill their victims, and guns further exacerbate the power, he's persistent, the power and control dynamic used by abusers to inflict emotional abuse and exert coercive control over their victims. Every month, an average of 70 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner. Nearly 1 million women alive today have reported being shot or shot at by intimate partners, and 4.5 million women have reported being threatened with a gun by an intimate partner. In more than half of mass shootings over the past decade, the perpetrator shot a current or former intimate partner or family member as part of the rampage. The ripple effects of firearms in the hands of an abuser extend far beyond the intimate relationship, affecting children who witness or live with it, and the family members, co-workers, and law enforcement officers who respond to it. While the deadly intersection of guns and intimate partner violence affects all women, it has a disproportionate impact on Black American, Indian, Alaska Native, and Hispanic women. In addition, segments of the LGBTQ+ community and people with disabilities are highly vulnerable to severe forms of relationship abuse. But there is alarmingly little data on the intersection of firearms and intimate partner violence among these populations because of chronic and underreporting. Tonight, we're grateful to have joining us representatives of various organizations working to protect women and children from violence in general and gun violence more specifically. Gayle Oko, Ambassador Sandy Hook Promise, a national organization based in Newton, Connecticut. Katie Fox, State Extreme Risk Lead and co-lead of the Commonwealth Project of the Virginia chapter of Moms Demand Action, and Mike Fox, State Legislative Lead of the Virginia chapter of Moms Demand Action. Madison Furgurson, Lethality Assessment Program Coordinator of the Shelter for Help in Emergency, known as SHE, Charlottesville, and Renee Branson, Executive Director, Sexual Assault Resource Agency, SARA, Charlottesville. Welcome all. Thank you for joining us this evening and sharing your time and expertise on this critically important topic. And thank you this evening to Virginia Dougherty, a fellow Seville Now board member, who will be assisting with introductions and facilitating the Q&A. Please put your questions for the speakers in the chat as they occur to you, and Virginia will present them to the speakers after everyone has presented. Our first speaker is Renee Branson, who is the lucky person flying to London tonight, and unfortunately for us, will have to leave our meeting a bit early. We are so lucky to have her here tonight. Renee joined the Sexual Assault Resource Agency, SARA, in January 2021 as the Executive Director of the agency. Ms. Branson has been part of Charlottesville nonprofit community for years, having served as a program director at Ready Kids and as Associate Development Director at the Miller Center Foundation. She is a certified resilience coach, CREC, with a BS in education and a master's degree in counseling psychology. SARA, the Sexual Assault Resource Agency, has served the greater Charlottesville community for over 40 years. Services include therapy for sexual assault survivors and their families, 24/7 emergency room accompaniment and hotline, Green Dot bystander intervention training, and prevention education with local schools, churches, and businesses. SARA's vision is a community free from sexual violence. The agency has continued to offer these services throughout the pandemic. Renee, I'll turn over for you. I hope you're there.
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
We can, thank you.
Good. I'm literally standing in line. I'm ready to board a plane. So bear with me. I'm going to be with you for as long as I can. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much to everyone who is joining and really putting the forefront, this to the forefront. You know, I talk a lot about how different forms of violence, different forms of oppression are all kind of rooted in the same thing, right? It is all that intersectional kind of wellspring that these things come from. And I want to make sure that most of the time tonight is given to the true experts in the field of gun violence. We've got some amazing people here tonight, but I wanted just to share a little bit about how that intersects with sexual violence. And what we know, of course, is that threats of lethality and lethality dramatically increases when there is a gun present. I mean, that seems almost right of course. But one of the things that I think a lot of folks, one of the things I wanted to kind of look at this from the opposite side is that there are a lot of folks who say, well, you know what, women need guns for protection. We want women to be safe. So we want to put guns in the hands of women so they can be safe. And I can even understand, for instance, women who have been through this, who are traumatized, who want to do anything to keep themselves safe and protected, might very well, right? It makes sense, right? Like, I'm going to do anything I can to protect myself. But what we really need to help folks understand, and women understand, that that's actually a myth. There's no data to back this up. There is the fact is that of justifiable homicides, only 7.7% of those are women who have killed their assailants, their rape assailants. So but we also know that the lethality is exponentially greater when there is a gun present. So the data doesn't work out. The data just doesn't withstand. So that's really when we talk about prevention, it's not about not only, arming women, or even, quite frankly, showing them, any kind of self-defense. It's really about prevention. Comes from how we change the culture of sexual violence. We work with changing that rape culture. So it has nothing to do with that sense of, well, we're going to arm ourselves and protect ourselves. It's fake. It's a myth. So those are things. That's why I think we certainly know, and She Shelter, we certainly work closely with them, and they know even better and see this more from their perspective. The idea that living with a gun in the home with your abuser is also will increase that exponentially. So that's essentially kind of the gist of our messaging around gun violence, is that it's not a protectant, even though that's the catchphrase, right? We've got to protect women. Let's give them a gun. That's a myth, and that it raises the chance and raises the risk of lethality.
Thank you very much.
Our next speaker tonight is Gayle Oko. Gayle lives in Mystic, Connecticut with her husband and has an adult son and daughter. She became a Sandy Hook Promise leader the day of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School mass shooting in 2018. She is active tabling at events and writing letters to the editor and to her representatives. She partners with organizations such as Moms Demand Action in fundraising, and she speaks at public events at churches and schools and many other organizations. In fact, she is now given the title Sandy Hook Promise Ambassador. Sandy Hook Promise, a nonprofit, was founded and led by several family members whose loved ones were killed at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012. Its intent is to honor all victims of gun violence by turning the Sandy Hook tragedy into a moment of transformation. I'd like to turn it over now to Gayle. Thanks, Gayle.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to speak tonight about Sandy Hook Promise and their wonderful work and their violence prevention programs. Virginia already spoke a little bit about who Sandy Hook Promise is, and most of you know the story of the 20 first graders and 6 adults that were murdered in a mass shooting back in December of 2012. And after the shooting happened, many professionals came in to help the parents make sense of this, such as researchers and educators, criminologists, psychologists. And in January of the next year, basically 1 month later, several of the parents began to organize and wanting to make a promise to their children and other children that they would do everything within their power to prevent gun violence. And so they, along with the professionals, developed some actually 2 violence prevention programs. And these are research and evidence-based programs. And, so I have so much admiration for them because they took this unimaginable pain and they transformed it into something powerful and something really valuable. And to date, 23,000 schools around the country have the programs, are implementing these programs. Their mission is to create a culture change that prevents violence and other harmful acts that hurt children. And they've won many awards and for their campaigns and for the programs, such as just a couple of them, top rated charity for great nonprofits. They won the Roosevelt Institute Award, the Guide Star Platinum Transparency Award, and the Child Abuse Prevention Services Award, among others. So they developed two approaches. One side of the Sandy Hook Promise approach is the violence prevention programs. And then on the other side, the other approach is what they call their Action Fund. The Action Fund is nonpartisan. And basically what they're doing is they're advocating for sensible gun laws, and they're working to pass legislation that advances school safety and mental health and prevents gun violence. To date, there are 8,300 promise leaders, such as myself, around the country. And a promise leader is an individual who makes a promise to do everything within their power to stop violence in any form. And this is the way that Sandy Hook Promise organized, by having people around the country sign up to become promise leaders. So it becomes a kind of boots on the ground. The promise leaders are out there all over the country in schools and organizations, just like I am, advocating for sensible gun laws, advocating for violence prevention laws, and speaking for Sandy Hook Promise to get the message out, create awareness. So as Virginia mentioned, when this Douglas High School, that's a tongue twister, in Florida, when that mass shooting happened in 2018, I knew that it wasn't enough for me to sit in front of the TV and cry my heart out anymore. I knew that I had to be part of the solution. And I knew that I couldn't expect other people to make the changes. I had to help create the change also. And so and the reason I chose Sandy Hook Promise to become involved with is because I really strongly resonated in their approach to violence prevention. The approach is really at the foundational level. It's to create a culture shift of inclusion and education. And, I read about the fact that research finds that people who are lonely, isolated, excluded, and hurting in some way are the strongest indicators of people who may go on to hurt themselves or others. And so I love that these violence prevention programs, they're not taught just once, but rather year after year after year, from kindergarten all the way up through high school. And currently, curricula is being developed for the college level students. So, the value in this is that it really is starting from the foundational level. It can't get more foundational than kindergarten to be speaking about how to look out for others, how to include and not exclude others, and how to look out for those kids that are excluded or who are lonely. And I'll tell you a little bit about the programs to help you see how those things are taught. And the other thing is that when these skills and this education is taught, kids go back into their families and into their communities with this information. And essentially kids are teaching kids. Other adults that learn this are teaching other adults. So, this just grows the way I see it. And this is why I resonated with this so strongly. So, I became a promise leader. And now as a promise leader ambassador, like Virginia said, I'm doing as much as I can. I'm speaking, I'm writing letters, I'm calling legislators, I'm tabling events, I'm involved in fundraising and everything within my power. I can't do everything, but I can do something. And so now I'd like to just briefly explain these violence prevention programs. You might be thinking, if you've never had any association with them, you might wonder, what are they? What is that? Well, they have two. And the first one is called Start with Hello. So, and by the way, both of these programs are at no cost. So Sandy Hook Promise is funded solely on donations. And they don't want money to get in the way of being able to put these programs into schools and youth organizations. So everything is at no cost. So this particular program, Start with Hello, it teaches a culture of inclusivity and empathy, and it teaches students to be more socially inclusive and connected to one another. And they do this by activities and curricula available for all ages, designed for all the different developmental ages, all the way up through high school. So that at the end, students are empowered to end social isolation at their level. And it's taught in 3 easy steps. Very simple. They're taught, if you see someone alone, step 1 is to notice, to become aware. Step 2, reach out and help. Step 3, start with hello. It sounds so simple, but even adults have trouble when they see people that are alone. Even adults have trouble reaching out and saying hello. So, by teaching the littlest of kids all the way through, it just becomes second nature. You're noticing people that are sitting alone in the lunchroom, as an example. You're noticing people who, or we'll talk about students, but you're noticing students out in the playground when all the kids are grouped up together in their little cliques. They start as young as preschool in little cliques. But then, kids will start to notice other kids that are being excluded, and hopefully they'll go reach out and they'll say hello and include them. I've seen this, by the way, in action. And this is why I so love this, because I see it in action and it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. So that program is intended for students K through 12. Now, the second program is called Say Something. And this program is intended for students in grades 6 through 12. The program teaches middle school and high school students to recognize the warning signs of someone who is at risk of hurting themselves or others, and how to say something to a trusted adult to get help. And here again, there's 3 basic simple steps that are taught and reinforced. Basic steps are: recognize the signs, act immediately and take it seriously, and then say something to a trusted adult or report it on an anonymous reporting system. Because today's students spend so much time online, research shows us now that many of these horrible acts of violence, there are signs and warning signs and sometimes diatribes on social media about the fact that people are going to do something. And, in the past, what's happened is other students have seen things. Unfortunately, I couldn't show a little slideshow because there's just like amazing things that are real life warning signals that kids have put out. By kids, I mean just all the way through, mostly the older kids, of course. Just different warning signs, either pictures of guns or saying they're going to blow up the school, or saying I can't take this anymore, or saying I'm going to hurt you, better not come to school tomorrow. I mean, there are literally thousands of warning signs that were missed by other students. So this program, the reason it's, again, so valuable is it teaches the students, take it seriously. Don't just swipe by it. If you see something like that, take it seriously. And then it teaches students how to report it, who to report it to, who becomes a trusted adult that they could, trust to go up with this information. Because we all know that oftentimes kids don't want to be tattletales. We used to call tattletales. Sometimes they call it snitches. That's kind of the new term. But in any case, students are a little hesitant to report things because they're so afraid that other students will find out that they, reported. This takes the stigma right out of that. And it teaches that all students, reporting someone's behavior, reporting something that they saw, is not a snitch or a tattletale. It is really an act of compassion and kindness and love, truly, to report something. So, and it gives the students a way to do this and how to do it. So, and the other thing about these programs is the students aren't the only ones that are participating. It's all the administration in the school as well as parents. And they're so flexible. You build these programs right into the school schedule. All schools are a little different with their schedules, but these programs are designed to be very flexible. They're designed to be student-led, because we know that is so much more powerful when the students are invested in something and they're actually doing the leading In fact, in many schools, a lot of the older students are teaching the younger students. So those are basically the two programs. And a real side note that I just forgot to mention, and Sandy Hook Promise is there every step of the way. Not only are they there and available for teachers and administrators and parents or whoever decides to lead in a school for any questions or guidance on how to get started, but they've also put together these wonderful guides for students, parents, and teachers that are all online, easily accessible, and give a ton of ideas about just different ways to, to recognize the signs and to include and create a culture of inclusivity. So, and then, what I've seen in a lot of the schools I've been in is that the students are coming up with ideas of their own too, activities and writing assignments. There's even math assignments in there that tie everything together. So they're really brilliantly done. I just love them. So those are basically the two programs in a nutshell. Sandy Hook Promise also has a Say Something anonymous reporting system. This reporting system they are offering to all schools at no cost. And they have a whole group of people around the clock 24/7 that are standing by to take in any anonymous tips that are being, that are being called in. And so that help can be found for people that students that are in crisis. So this is a way, there's apps, there's a hotline, there's a website. This is a way that students could, report something that they've seen or heard without anyone knowing about it. Then anonymity is really important, especially for students. And then there's a national organization called Students Against Violence Everywhere. It's been around for a long, long time, actually back into the mid to late 70s, and otherwise known as SAVE, Students Against Violence Everywhere. What happens is, and there's thousands of them all over the country, and basically what it is, it's one of the clubs in school. So, and they're even put into elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. Sandy Hook Promise has partnered with that organization, and for schools that have that club, that Students Against Violence Everywhere club, they intermingle the Sandy Hook Promise programs with the club. And then there again, the students are leading, and it becomes so much more powerful if the students are leading, they're invested, and other students are looking up to the ones that are the leaders. Some of the statistics that of the impact of this organization so far. Now, they've been around for 10 years now. I can't even believe it's been 10 years since all that happened. But to date, 82,000 tips, anonymous tips, have come in to report acts of violence, and 60 acts of violence with a weapon have been prevented. Amazing. 296 confirmed lives have been saved with crisis interventions because of these programs. 8 planned school shootings have been prevented. And something called the Student Teachers and Officers Preventing School. This is a tongue twister too. Students, Teachers, and Officers Preventing School Violence Act, otherwise known as the STOP Act, was enacted in 2019. And this provides funding grants to schools to be used for implementing security measures. So Sandy Hook Promise took the lead on that. So that's what Sandy Hook Promise has been up to. And you've heard me say promise, promise a lot here. I just would like to read you what the promise is. And this is the promise. The promise is, I promise to do all I can to protect children from gun violence by encouraging and supporting solutions that create safer, healthier homes, schools, and communities. So that's the promise. So to learn more, to take the promise, look at the details of any of those programs. If something's piquing your interest about putting it in your school system, you can go right to sandyhookpromise.org. And also just take a look on the internet if you're curious and interested in Sandy Hook Promise. There's so much that they have been doing in the last 10 years that is recorded through through words and videos on YouTube. You just put in Sandy Hook Promise, and there's just a ton of stuff. And it's so heartening, and it's so wonderful to think that people don't have to feel helpless. I was feeling helpless, and 4 or 5 years ago, I was feeling helpless. I really was, and really hopeless, but I don't anymore, because I am involved in something that I believe in, and something that I truly believe is making a difference. So thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak about Sandy Hook Promise.
Thank you so much, Gayle. Our next speakers are Katie and Mike Fox. Katie started in Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America as events led, and then local group lead as events lead. And then thank you so much for correcting me. And then local group lead of the Crozet Group. She is now state extreme risk lead and co-lead of the Virginia chapter's Commonwealth Project, a statewide initiative to involve members without active local groups. She is a gun owner and part of the Everytown Survivor Network as a survivor both of suicide loss and suicidal ideation. Katie is passionate about suicide prevention and leads One Thing You Can Do presentations on extreme risk protection orders. Welcome, Katie.
Thanks.
Mike is the state legislative lead for the Virginia chapter of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. He is also part of the organization's national mentorship program. He has been a gun violence prevention advocate since 2007 and joined Moms Demand Action as the Charlottesville group's legislative lead in 2018. And just a reminder to our audience again, if you have questions for our speakers, please continue to type them into the chat for the Q&A. Okay, welcome Katie and Mike.
Thank you so much, and thank you now for having us and for holding this very important discussion. Moms Demand Action is a nationwide grassroots nonpartisan coalition of, as we say, mothers and others who believe in a future free from gun violence. We have a chapter in every state and have about 7 million volunteers strong, which is more members than the NRA has. We also have Students Demand Action for students to create their own groups in either colleges or universities.
And high schools.
And high schools. And other public schools. I'm going to talk tonight about the realities of domestic violence and the intersection with guns, and talk about some of the laws that we have and some of the laws that we should have. And Katie's going to go into more depth about extreme risk laws, better known as red flag laws. Guns can turn domestic violence deadly, as we talked about. Abusers use guns to threaten and control victims, whether it's brandishing a weapon, cleaning it in front of a victim, or threatening to use one. And these threats often escalate to murder. The deadly intersection of guns and domestic violence has a disproportionate impact on Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Latina women in particular. In more than half of mass shootings, the perpetrator shot an intimate partner or family member. Every month, an average of 70 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner. 4.5 million women have reported being threatened with a gun by an intimate partner. 1 million women in the US alive today have reported being shot or shot at by an intimate partner. Women living in households with a firearm are at greater risk of homicide and 5 times more likely that a woman will die at the hands of a domestic abuser. This is regardless of whose gun it is. One study found that women who had been threatened with a gun by their abuser or feared one would be used against them suffered more severe PTSD symptoms than those who had not endured threats with a gun. As we talked about earlier, the ripple effects of guns in the hands of an abuser extend far beyond the intimate relationship. This affects children, family members, co-workers, and the law enforcement officers who respond to it. For children under age 13 who are victims of gun homicide, nearly 1/3 are connected to intimate partner or family violence. Between 2009 and 2020, nearly 3 in 4 children and teens killed in mass shootings died in an incident connected to domestic violence. There's also ample evidence that children who survive and witness the death of their parent from intimate partner violence suffer life-altering consequences, including PTSD, behavioral problems, and suicidal thoughts. Research clearly shows that federal and state policies and practices that disrupt abusers' access to guns can save lives. In 2021, Virginia enacted legislation to prohibit people convicted of some domestic violence misdemeanors from accessing firearms, namely those convicted of the crime of assault and battery against a family or household member for 3 years following the conviction. Virginia has no law generally requiring the removal of firearms from or the surrender of firearms by persons who have become prohibited from possessing them, however. Although a 2020 law provides a process for the surrender of firearms by a person who has become subject to a final criminal protective order. However, Virginia does not prohibit individuals convicted of all violence, domestic violence misdemeanors or domestic violence crimes against a dating partner, for example, from possessing firearms or ammunition. So reforms really fall into two categories. Expanding the so-called prohibited purchasers list. These are Americans who are barred from possessing guns because of a conviction or a commitment. And disarm dangerous people who are banned from having guns. Federal law should be amended to fill dangerous gaps in the law that enable people with dangerous histories to have guns. Federal law does not automatically apply to all violent offenders, stalkers, abusive dating partners, hate criminals, and people who are involuntarily committed for mental illness. For example, the so-called boyfriend loophole. Federal law prohibits domestic abusers from having guns only if the abuser has been married to, has lived with, or has a child in common with the victim. It does not cover abusive dating partners. Under federal law, there is no affirmative requirement that people who are prohibited from having guns turn in firearms that they already have. Background checks should be expanded to include private sales, such as online and at gun shows, which Virginia has done. And we should also close the Charleston loophole that allows a firearm transaction to proceed if a background check isn't completed within 3 days. This is how the gunman in Charleston, South Carolina, obtained his weapon to murder parishioners at a Black church. Virginia changed its state law in 2021 to allow for 5 days. And extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws should be implemented, such as Virginia's, to temporarily disarm people who pose a risk to themselves or others. And Katie can talk more about that.
Yeah, so I'm in a unique position as the state extreme risk lead for our extreme risk order. To talk about how the process works and who is allowed to bring these petitions to the court. I'm also uniquely positioned as a gun owner who supports the Second Amendment and believes in the right to bear arms, but having also been on the other side as a survivor of suicide loss which led to my own suicidal ideation. Through high school. I lost a good friend my sophomore year of high school to gun suicide. So that was why all of this is incredibly important to me. So in Virginia, our extreme risk protection order is called a substantial risk order. And that gives you the ability to intervene if you are worried about your loved one or someone like a former partner getting access to a gun and hurting themselves or someone else. The order is issued by a civil court and designed to help family or law enforcement keep a person at risk from having access to a gun until the crisis passes. It temporarily prohibits a person from possessing or purchasing guns. In Virginia, only law enforcement officers or Commonwealth's attorneys can petition the court for the substantial risk order. So family, friends, partners would have to bring their evidence to one of those people in order to begin the process. And in a crisis situation, a court can issue an emergency order that would immediately suspend access to firearms. This ensures everyone's safety until the court is able to schedule a more thorough hearing to hear evidence about what's happening. This all respects due process. Although it's possible for the court to issue an emergency substantial risk order, there's always a court hearing before the order is finalized. And the person will then have the opportunity to present evidence to prove that they don't present a threat to themselves or anyone else. The hearings are held within 14 days. And at that hearing, the court evaluates whether the final substantial risk order is needed. And the person who is subject to that order is able to contest it. If the final order is issued, the person is prohibited from possessing guns for the duration of the order, which can be up to 6 months. The other important part of this whole process is that it does not rely on a mental health diagnosis. This is especially important for 2 reasons. The first is that the majority of people with mental health diagnoses don't pose a threat of violence. That's been proven true by data. And second, most people who do die by suicide with a gun or harm others with a gun don't have a diagnosed mental illness. On the other hand, many people who do exhibit concerning behavior or warning signs before they act are able to be seen by their family members or their friends and loved ones. That's why when issuing a substantial risk order, the court takes into consideration a person's behavior, but won't rely on whether there's been a diagnosis. It's also why the role of family is so critical, with family members and friends and partners being the first people who will see these warning signs, and it allows them to intervene. So thank you guys.
Thanks again for having us.
Thank you very much, Mike and Katie. I appreciate the work you all are doing in the state of Virginia. And also, thanks for giving us so much good information about the laws on this, which I certainly was not aware of. Our next speaker is Madison Furgurson, who is a Master of Social Work and a legal advocate at the Shelter for Help in Charlottesville. And she's been working with victims of domestic and sexual violence since 2016. In her current position as the Lethality Assessment Program Coordinator, she trains local law enforcement to use a survey that measures the level of violence for a victim on the scene of domestic incidents. And she can immediately refer the victim to services they need, or the officers can. She also supports clients by going with the client through the criminal process by attending court procedures, as well as interviews with prosecutors and law enforcement. The Shelter for Help is well known in the community, and it works to support and empower victims of domestic violence. So we're very happy to have you here, Madison.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to share my screen, hopefully, because I have some slides, just pretty brief, just in case you feel like you need something to look at while I'm talking with you all. Hopefully you can see that, okay? If I can put it into the slideshow. There we go. So a lot has already been said by others about the intersection of guns and domestic violence. We know that they make situations more dangerous. As much as I wish it was as simple as giving women access to guns that would make them safer. Unfortunately, in domestic violence situations where you're living with your abuser and they're going to have the same access to guns that you are, it just makes things more dangerous, unfortunately. A lot of these statistics were already stated by people. They make these situations more dangerous. We've already talked about some of the laws briefly that address firearms that we have in Virginia. I'll go over them just one more time. We talked a lot about risk orders. So I appreciate the information that's already been given about the substantial risk orders. Just to mention, typically what I see mostly with my clients is that they are petitioning for a protective order, which is something that they can do by themselves, but it's very difficult to do without an advocate or someone, a victim witness advocate, or someone like myself to help guide through the process of which court you need to be in, what papers need to be filled out, what the process looks like. But essentially, if a victim has been threatened with violence, or there's been an actual incident of violence, they can go to the court and petition for a protective order that would prohibit their abuser from having any kind of contact with them. It can give the victim primary possession of the residence, which is a really important piece for our clients, because many of them don't have family or friend support because they've been isolated by their abuser. So being able to stay in the home while the abuser is excluded from the home is really important for them. And for especially for our clients that have children, having a place to stay and not having to relocate, not having to worry about changing schools or how it's going to affect their work. Being able to stay in the home is a big piece of why protective orders are helpful. There are some other provisions that help victims. And then if a permanent protective order, which can last up to 2 years, if that's granted by the court, then there is a law stating that the person under the protective order would be prohibited from purchasing, possessing, or transporting firearms. I will add that there isn't a law that requires them to surrender their firearms, but they are in Charlottesville. The prosecutors, as soon as either the plea agreement or the conviction is handed down, or the protective order is granted in court, the abuser is handed a form where they're asked, do they have firearms? How many do they have and where are they located? Do they have a concealed carry permit? And the person is required to sign that form acknowledging that either they are going to sell those firearms or get rid of them in some other way, and they have to give that form to the court. So, you know, it's just like protective orders, it's a piece of paper. We're relying that this person is being truthful. But it's, you know, a step in the right direction. I will say that when victims file for the protective order in the beginning, those forms also ask the victim to for their knowledge of whether their partner has access to firearms, so that the victim can play a part in, you know, later on down the line, if the abuser tries to say, I don't own any, I don't have to worry about this piece, the victim can testify to, no, I've seen it, I know where it is on our house. So they do have to ask the victim as well about the person's access to firearms. And then this new law last year in 2021 that was passed prohibits anyone convicted of assault against a family or household member from prohibiting or purchasing or transporting for 3 years. I believe the prosecutors have also developed a similar form that's given to the abuser that they have to testify to whether they have firearms, how many, and how they're going to get rid of them. Again, not a perfect process, but that's what we're working with right now. The one piece I'd like to add about protective orders and substantial risk orders is that the courts are asking to see evidence of an act of violence or a threat of violence. And that leaves out a huge chunk of what domestic violence looks like. It does not consider emotional abuse, financial abuse, all of the other ways that abusers control and make victims feel unsafe. So that's why I added that in research that was done on intimate partner homicides, in 28 to 33% of those cases, the first incidence of violence was the homicide. So the courts have failed to acknowledge a huge chunk of other behaviors that can predict violence besides direct threats or physical assault. So that's really frustrating for me and for my clients when they're experiencing something that makes them feel unsafe, that is detrimental to their mental health and the mental health of their family, their children. But it doesn't fall under those two behaviors, you know, a direct threat or an actual act of violence. So that's tough for me and for my clients, but we do the best that we can in terms of trying to find other ways to keep them safe if the courts are not able to provide them that safety. I mean, the other piece, again, is that protective orders are a piece of paper and they rely on the fact that the other person has respect for the law. And a lot of times they either aren't in the right state of mind or just the thought of being arrested doesn't scare them. And it also, in order to violate a protective order, the victim has to report it. And so a lot of times victims feel like, I don't want to get them in more trouble. I don't want to ruin their lives. I don't want them to lose their jobs. And so these protective orders aren't effective. They can't be enforced unless the victim feels safe and feels confident enough to report when it's violated. I also want to talk a little bit about the lethality assessment program. It was mentioned a little bit in my bio, but essentially it's a set of questions that were created based on research done by a doctor at Johns Hopkins. She interviewed families of women that had been murdered and also interviewed women that had survived an attempted murder. And she looked at all of these interviews and found certain behaviors that were common amongst the relationships in the year prior to the homicide or the attempted homicide. So from all of this research, she also found that there was high rates of interaction with law enforcement. So the abuser had been arrested in the year prior to the homicide, or police had been called, usually multiple times in the year prior to the homicide. So high rates of interaction with law enforcement, but very, very low. I think 4% of those victims of homicide or victims of attempted homicide had reached out to community resources. So they wanted to bridge that gap between interaction with law enforcement and getting further community resources, because they also found that women that did reach out, that did go to emergency shelter, were less likely to experience assaulted or be murdered by their partner. So they created the set of 11 questions that's designed to be used by law enforcement on the scene of a domestic incident. So after they concluded their investigation, they ask the victim if they're able to ask these questions. So it's voluntary. We're not forcing anyone to give more information than they already have. But it's actually pretty rare that people refuse to answer questions or decline to participate. And based on their answers to those 11 questions, they're given a score of either not high danger or high danger. The survey also allows for, if the person's answers to the questions don't give them a score of high danger, the officer can also use their discretion and they can score them as high danger based on the officer's beliefs. So if they feel like maybe the victim doesn't feel comfortable being completely truthful, or if it's just a case of they're being totally honest, but their answers don't add up to a high danger, the officer can also use their discretion. But essentially anyone that scores as high danger, the officer informs them, based on the answers to these questions, I'm really concerned about your safety, and other people in your situation have been killed. So I'm going to call the She Shelter hotline and tell them a little bit about what's going on. And I'd like for you to speak to them as well. And so the idea is that hopefully we can quickly get those that are in high danger referred to our services, whether they need our emergency shelter or whether they just need, you know, case management or counseling, whatever it might be. We want to get those people into services as quickly as possible if they're willing to participate. So that's a big portion of my job, basically 50% assisting clients with, you know, court proceedings. I'm not a lawyer, I can't represent them, but just helping them guide through the process and being a support for them during that time. And then 50% training our local law enforcement to use this survey and how to talk to victims of violence, help them understand better what it means to, you know, why victims act the way that they do. And also trying to encourage more law enforcement agencies to participate, because the Shelter for Help and Emergency covers the city of Charlottesville, Albemarle County, Greene County, Nelson, Louisa, and Fluvanna. And currently 3 of those counties don't participate in this program. Greene, 2 of them, Greene and Nelson counties are not participating in this program with us right now. So that's part of my job as well, is trying to create those relationships and encouraging them to see this program as helpful for victims, but also helpful for law enforcement too, in developing relationships with victims so that they'll be more likely to cooperate with the investigation down the line, but also so that, you know, officers aren't having to respond to the same house over and over again and nothing changes. Because prior to this program, the only thing that law enforcement could do is, you know, arrest the person and say, I'm really worried about you, I hope you get some help. But typically, especially, you know, the most common charge we see is domestic assault. So they arrest the person, take them to the magistrate, and they immediately get bonded out on their own recognizance, because, you know, assuming they don't have a lengthy criminal history. So it's a very short window of time that victims have to get services. And prior to this program, there wasn't a whole lot that law enforcement could do, aside from, you know, if the officers knew about our services, they could say, hey, there's this place called the She Shelter, you should call them. So it gives them an extra step too. I think that helps them feel like they're doing more to not keep going to the same house over and over again, and not being able to do something further. So super quickly, I don't want to take up too much time, just want to go over the services that we have. We have our 24-hour hotline. And we have a language line, so anyone that speaks in language besides English, we're able to talk to them using that. We have our short-term shelter where people can stay up to 6 weeks, and then we have 2 transitional houses where people can stay for up to 2 years as they're trying to rebuild their lives. We have legal advocacy, as I mentioned, like myself, that will accompany people and support them through any legal process that they're having. Case management to help them apply for jobs, apply for benefits, whatever assistance they need. Typical social work services in rebuilding their lives. We have individual counseling and support groups. We have a child advocate that will assist parents in getting services for their children, working with Child Protective Services if there's a case open with them, and working with the children's schools as well to make sure that they can, you know, if they need to get transferred, if they need to arrange for them to be, to, you know, get the bus from our shelter, all of those things. And then, you know, prevention education with kids in our schools and community education, like what we're doing right now. So thank you all for having me. Oh, and just one shameless plug. If you feel called to donate items, this list is on our website as well. I will note that right now we can't take clothing, purses, toys, books, just because we have a limited storage space and lots of those things right now, but there are things that we do need that will help the residents in our shelter. So feel free to look at it on our website as well. But thank you so much for putting this together and putting this information out there and for inviting us to participate.
Thank you so much, Madison. Thank you so much for your organization and all that it's doing, for all the information actually that all of you shared with us tonight. This is such a serious, persistent crisis, and it is so important for us to better understand the continuing challenges, how your wonderful organizations work to combat and resolve this problem, and how we as members of the NOW community can personally support and assist in this process here in Charlottesville. I imagine our audience has some questions for you all, so let's start our Q&A. Audience members, please enter your questions in the chat if you haven't already done so. Virginia, take it away.
Okay, the first question is from Ed Strickler, and the question is, should children be encouraged or taught to report if there are illegal guns in their home? And I'll just throw that open to anyone. I mean, is that something a child should be encouraged to tell a responsible adult if there are illegal guns in their home? And who would the responsible adult be?
So I'll touch this. I don't know how a child would know that it is an illegal gun. I understand the question, but I do not understand how a child would know that it's an illegal gun. I grew up in a house with guns. That's so it
I imagine a teenager would know.
probably not.
Probably not.
Not unless it was talked about openly in the home. And at that point, it is something that has been taught to the child as something that's fine. There is a culture in gun ownership, and that gets passed down through the generations. And so if you've been taught that what we're doing is just fine, that's what normal people do, they're not going to question that, and they're not going to believe that that gun is illegal.
Another question, this is for Gayle. I understand that Sandy Hook just won a big settlement by suing a gun manufacturer. And I just wondered, I don't know whether the rest of you've heard of that, but it was this huge settlement that's unprecedented. It was for $73 million.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question is, it seems like that's another approach to this problem. And do you think that other people could follow the same pattern in suing a gun company for, you know, how their guns were used for a mass killing or whatever, you know?
Right. I really don't feel qualified to speak to that question, but just as a personal citizen, yes, I would hope more people do that. You know, supply and demand, and if they get in the hand, you know, the wrong hands, that's trouble. So, I mean, we were thrilled about that personally at Sandy Hook Promise. We were just thrilled about it. Anytime there's a bring down of either a loudmouth like Alex Jones, who you probably heard of that one, where he was, you know, saying that the shooting never happened. It was all crisis actors. You know, he was sued also, or like a gun manufacturer. I mean, we're all personally behind the scenes thrilled at it, but I really don't know the answer to that question, except from a citizen standpoint. Yes, I hope more people do that. I hope that sets a precedent. I really do.
Was the suit against Alex Jones successful? Or
Yes, it was.
It was.
Yes, it was. Yep. And he had a big microphone and a big megaphone, and he just blasted all his angry vial, and people believed him. That's the sad thing, the scary thing too. that somebody could just get behind a microphone and spew hate and ignorance and horrible things that really re-traumatize those poor parents and families and get away with it. So hopefully that's a precedent too.
There's actually a federal law that shields the firearms industry and gun dealers from certain federal lawsuits when it comes to liability. And if that was repealed, then we would be able to hold more of these companies liable when they make their weapons available to criminals in high crime areas and things like that. That's why it was enacted, was to protect the industry from lawsuits that were trying to hold them accountable. So if that was repealed, then not only would we be able to hold manufacturers more accountable, but it would open up their files, their records and everything, so we can see all the inner workings of how the manufacturers operate and shadiness and things like that. So that's the big priority for us.
The other part of that, talking about liability, is it was after the Michigan shooting that there were charges pressed against the parents, the gun owning parents, and the ones who facilitated the gun ownership to that gunman, for their part in arming him when they knew that he was not safe around firearms. So that is another angle that could be taken for shooters like the one in Buffalo that had multiple run-ins with the law and was known to have issues, and his parents still bought him a gun and he had body armor. It's just the pieces that add up, and there is a liability there for the parents that facilitated that.
Okay, another question is has been touched on, but not totally. What is being done or can be done to educate law enforcement and judges about how gun violence works and domestic violence works? I mean, is that, I think some of the things have been mentioned about training police officers, but nobody has mentioned training judges.
Yeah, I will say, we can, how do I put this? We would love to educate them if they wanted to participate. Our organization personally doesn't have any training that we do for judges. We have invited them to join our domestic violence council meetings that we have monthly with local service providers like ourselves, prosecutors, social services. We meet monthly to discuss how we're serving victims of domestic violence. We've invited local judges to attend that, and that's something that's hopefully in the works, because we do have a judge in Charlottesville that responded very positively to that, and hopefully we can get them involved in talking with us and just being part of the community network of how we serve victims of domestic violence. But I don't know. I know that they go to yearly conferences and trainings, but I don't know who provides that. I can't imagine that it's required. And then in terms of law enforcement, we offer the trainings on the lethality assessment program, and we don't just do it once. We try to do it at least every 6 months so that they get refreshed on the information, and then we also catch any new hires that haven't been trained yet. I go to the crisis intervention training, so I know a representative from SARA, the Sexual Assault Resource Agency, also goes to the crisis intervention trainings, which are intended to train law enforcement how to respond to mental health crises. But myself and a representative from SARA also attend those trainings to talk about how to interact with someone that's had a crisis caused by, an assault, either by, a sexual assault or an incident with an intimate partner. So we do our best to engage with law enforcement and to train them on what our victims go through and why they act the way that they do, and give them suggestions about the best way to interact with them so that they're not re-traumatized, which, there's no way to stop that from happening when they interact with the criminal justice system, but to reduce the amount of victim blaming and shame that victims feel at the hands of law enforcement and other members of the criminal justice system. We do our best to interact with them and to provide as much training as we can. So the judges are trickier, but we're hoping to get them involved in the conversation.
Someone has asked, how is the shelter funded, Madison?
So primarily through state and federal grants. And then a smaller portion is through direct donations from individuals and corporations, but mostly from grants through the state and the federal Department of Justice is mostly how we're funded.
Another question about children reporting.
Pardon me, can I just jump in one moment?
Sure, go ahead.
So to add on to what Madison was saying about educating law enforcement and judges, so we've worked with our local law enforcement to make sure that they have information to hand out and know that there are trainings about our secure storage laws and our extreme risk order. And we've provided them with, we do a whole presentation about both of those things. So we provided them with those resources as well as postcards and placards and websites. So the thing that I would say about judges is that they all start out as lawyers. And so if we can teach them at the lawyer stage, then hopefully that knowledge will matriculate with them up to the judgeship.
Yeah, that would be great, because you could do it through the local bar association or something like that. Yeah. Another question about children reporting, and again, this is for everybody. Should children be encouraged to report deviant or threatening, dangerous behavior in their home to a confidential authority? Gayle, what about that? I mean, I know that that's a different kind of approach.
Different kind of reporting, but I really think, what I really think may happen with the number of children that are being taught about what is risky behavior is they'll start to become aware of what's happening at home. And they might, although not told, I'm not sure about this, but I have a feeling that because they're taught, they'll become aware of the risky behavior, more aware that there is an avenue to report, and we may see more of that just because they are aware of what is considered risky behavior or dangerous behavior.
Now, again, a question that hasn't been discussed, but I would like to hear an answer to. What kind of legislation do you think we can get passed nationally? Does anyone have any opinion on what? Can we get anything on automatic weapons? You all think we can?
Automatic weapons are already so restricted that is not a risk. Like, that is, machine guns and automatic weapons are regulated highly.
I think you're thinking of assault weapons, Virginia.
Yes, or
yes.
semi-automatic or whatever they are.
That's a hurdle. That would be a big hurdle at the federal level. It's a big hurdle here at the state level. There was an assault weapons bill that was proposed 2 years ago in Virginia when Democrats controlled the General Assembly, and it didn't make it out of the Senate. So that one in particular would be a high hurdle. The Violence Against Women Act was tied up forever because they wanted to close, Democrats wanted to close the boyfriend loophole. And I think the final product that they came out with didn't even have that. I think what they came up with has a provision that says that either law enforcement or the victim would be tipped off if they tried to buy a weapon at like a gun dealer and were denied. But it wasn't what we were looking for. At the federal level, especially now where it's such a small majority and all of that, it would be difficult to get anything too substantively passed. I think the best you can hope for is things that will help to fund the background check system and make it more efficient, make sure it has all the records it needs, and there's all this, because that's where a lot of these happen, is that the records aren't there, or there's miscommunication or something like that. That's usually the kind of stuff that passes in divided government or in closely divided government. So.
And may I also say that universal background checks have been, have bipartisan support and have gone through the House and are stalled now. So call your senators.
I will say there's been a lot of progress in the states. You have 19 states plus DC that have a red flag law now. You have more states that have expanded background checks, like Virginia has. Illinois just became the latest state to ban ghost guns, which are untraceable do-it-yourself weapons that you make from kits at home that allow people like abusers to circumvent background checks and things like that. So although other states are going in the opposite direction, you do see progress being made at the state level more than you do at the federal level. And I think that that's something that other states can look at and see, okay, well, what can we do here? So
I will say that I don't believe that an assault weapons ban will do as much as we hope it would to reduce gun violence. I see a note in the chat about hearing that an AR-15 is not technically an assault weapon. It depends on who you ask the definition of what an assault weapon is. The AR in that does not stand for assault rifle. It stands for Armalite rifle. So there's a lot of education and real nitty-gritty details that none of us have to get into, because the things that are more important that that would help more in reducing gun violence are things that would reduce intimate partner violence or reduce suicide rates. Those are what are going to reduce the gross number of gun deaths across the nation. Over 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. And so when you take those numbers into account, like, sure, the AR-15s are the choice weapon for going for school shootings, but those are only, what, 3% of the gun deaths across the nation. So looking at bigger picture and what fight you want to have, it's where you want to pick your battles. And so there are definitely, I think, better places to put our time and effort.
Sarah's asking about legislation on ghost guns. Here in Virginia, there were companion bills in the House and Senate. The one in the House failed in subcommittee. The House is controlled by Republicans. I will say the Senate one advanced out of the Senate with 2 Republican votes, and that in and of itself is something of a success. I am happy to say that at the federal level, the ATF and the Biden administration have stepped up and issued new regulations when it comes to ghost guns, because they're able to issue a new order on what counts as a firearm, what has to be subjected to, what components have to be subjected to a background check or be serialized or in some other way subjected to the kinds of regulations that typical guns would be. And I believe if it's not in effect already, it'll be in effect sometime this summer. And that's a big victory for us. We, of course, would like to see Senate companion bill or state companion bills so they can be enforced at the state level. But that's a big win, because ghost guns are becoming a serious problem across the country, even in domestic violence shootings, because if they're barred from from buying a gun, then they're going to find illegal means to do that. So that ghost guns is definitely a top priority for us.
Okay, everybody, I think I'll turn it back over.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. we're going to wrap up and all get engaged in fighting for better gun laws and reducing suicide and domestic violence and all the other ways we can help reduce gun violence. So thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it.